Yeah, it's a good question, actually. I'm not sure whether the Laudrup brothers ever did play together at Rangers. Obviously did for Denmark, but did they play together at Rangers? Who knows? That's the big question of the night. Very good evening and welcome along to Coach's Corner.
This is Coach's Corner, where grassroots football matters. Message us at officialBOTN and get involved in the debate.
We love that. That's our new Coach's Corner jingle. This is Coach's Corner live. Delighted that you've joined us tonight. We're going to be talking all about midfielders and specifically defensive midfielders. And I'm delighted to say that on that journey this evening, Peter Augustine, as usual, is joining us. Very good evening, Pete.
Hello, Ben. How are you? Good evening.
Nice to have you with us. And we're also delighted to say that Anthony Ferguson is with us as well. Anthony, hello and welcome to the show.
Good evening, Ben. Good evening, Peter. How are you guys doing? Okay?
Doing well.
Yeah.
Good to see you, Anthony.
We are talking tonight all about effective defending with midfield players. And as usual on this show, we want you to get involved across social media, whether that's on Facebook, Twitter or YouTube. Leave your comments. We'll put some of them up on the screen. And we'll try and answer your questions as well. That's what we're here to do. The biggest coaching show in the country is here for you and your questions. And we've got a format on this show that we've done the last couple of times that we've done it. If you are new, welcome. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about defensive midfielders, firstly in the Premier League, and we're going to keep it current, and we're going to talk about players at the moment that play in that role. We're going to look at some of the skills and the technical skills and the different skill sets that they need to have to play in that position, why they would play in that position, how it all works. And then we're going to put on a practice session, and it's for you to take away, it's for you to comment on, it's for you to get involved in. And hopefully by the end of it, it will have all made sense. So let's delve straight into it. Pete, defensive midfield players. It's a big subject, this. And I want to start off by looking at some of the classic players that we've had in this position. And when we were planning the show, we talked about who we were going to mention, and there are some real good candidates in the modern game, but there are certainly some players worth mentioning that have played throughout the years. So we think of the defensive midfield role. Am I right in thinking that perhaps, let's say from the 90s onwards, Roy Keane would have been one in the 90s in a 4-4-2, and Claude Makelele really made that role himself and almost got it named after him once it moved to a 3 in midfield and there really was that holding position. Those two definitely worth a mention.
Yeah, definitely. I think I think not only were they good defensive midfield players, they were a bit more than that as well, weren't they? They were able to break up play and then start attacks from the fact that they'd broken up play, which is a key role in that defensive midfielder's role. And now with the fast pace of the game, that's even more important. But Roy Keane was absolutely fearsome in that role. He drove the team forward. He was, not only did he break up play, but he got the players around him playing, and he was kind of almost, if you like, an archetypal type of defensive midfield player who actually helped teams to stay on the front foot, because quite often probably I think if you're playing against Roy Keane and you see him steaming towards you, you're thinking to yourself, I don't know if I actually want this ball. You might offer it off to somebody else to get themselves destroyed. And then you've got the likes of Makelele, who although he was much more, I thought, a little bit more stylish. He was probably a little bit more subtle the way he played in that role, but again, still breaking up play and driving the team forward.
Yeah, really good couple of examples of players there. Anthony, do you want to add anybody in? Because it was a big role, and certainly through the 90s there were some decent players in those positions.
Well, I always finish with Makelele because he is the epitome of the original holding midfielder. But at the same time, as Peter talks about Roy Keane, when you think about the Manchester United versus Arsenal battles, I've then got to talk about Patrick Vieira and Emmanuel Petit, who obviously played together not just for club but also for country. So when they transferred that and they played with people like Didier Deschamps, it was a natural role that they adopted when they played for both club and country. And when Peter talks about Roy Keane, I think he's got to be one of the best in terms of dominance, not just physically, but tactically, and also in terms of communication. And therefore, it almost built the team around him, and he was like the rock. Patrick Vieira, I just think, was very, very classy. I thought he could not just break up play, but also start attacks by stepping into and beyond the midfield, but also weighed in with a few goals as well. And if I step back even further than that, I would go back to Paul Davis.
Yeah, good player for Arsenal, yeah.
I think was not just a good friend, but he was a very classy player. And I suppose because he had a left foot, which is always seen as a much more, what's the word, aesthetic.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we'll come on to talk about that, because that's an important point. Players, and didn't mention Vieira in that first breath, because there are players like Vieira, probably put Gerrard in this as well, that can defend but also scored a lot of goals, and as you say, made a lot of creative things happen and got forward and got into the box. Let's mention some players now that are in the game today before we talk about that role and what the difference is perhaps between the defensive midfield player and somebody who's going to get forward and be more of a complete midfield player. Some of the names that we came up with earlier, you got Kante, who some say is the next Makelele, amazing in that role. Some of his stats over the last few seasons, certainly when Leicester won the league, were absolutely incredible, with the tackles won and the play that he broke up. You've also got players like Matic, who's just came into form for Manchester United again this year, also played for Chelsea. Jorginho, a lot of Chelsea players, we'll come on to that in a minute, a lot of Chelsea players have played that role well. Declan Rice being another one. There's a few defensive midfield players that are around at the moment. Let's talk more about what attributes they have, specifically those players, maybe old and new, and what attributes they have in that role.
I think it's that ability to sense danger. I think that's probably that's a big attribute for a player who plays in that role. And that would probably drop into that psychological corner for players of that ilk. Then you start to think about the physicality, the ability to get around the pitch, to make tackles, and then also that technical ability to be able to keep the ball for your team. So you just don't win it, you don't just give it away, you win it, you give it to another player, or you might carry it yourself. And what I've noticed is that those types of players are able to push into much more forward areas by driving the ball forward into those areas, maybe having shots at goal, that sort of stuff, which is something that I've seen Kante. He's been doing that quite a lot for Chelsea. I think under the last manager, he did that quite a bit more. But there is that. You got Pereira, who's another one at Leicester. Breaks up play, gets forward, and the players tend to switch roles a little bit more now than they used to in the past.
Yeah, and a couple of other players didn't mention. Fernandinho would have been one of those players, and also Ndidi, who's kind of taken on from where Kante left off in the Premier League, Anthony.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ndidi is a superb player. And, just to pick up on a few things that Peter said, and I think you're alluding to, is when we're out of possession, I think Kante and the likes of who we're talking about, their scanning skills, their ability to see almost 360 degrees without turning their head. And therefore, when we talk about players who can do that, I always say to players, have rabbit's eyes. Don't just look forwards or diagonally forwards. Can you see around the corners? And therefore, if you can then see those things, your anticipation and awareness becomes heightened. And it allows you then to step in and make many more interceptions. I was speaking to one of my colleagues, Brian, this week, and we were talking about how to attack when we're defending and how to vice versa. And I think if you've got a central midfielder who can read the play, intercept, should I say, and basically step in at the right time, that now gives your team a massive advantage, Ben. I really do.
Yeah, we're gonna have a look at this on Pete's tactical pad in a minute. Which before we get to the practice session that we'll look to put on a little bit later on in the show, we're going to just have a look at how the positioning of a defensive midfield player, maybe in a 2 and a 3, just to see the difference, how that works. And when teams are attacking, or what will probably be quite interesting, Pete, is when the team that they're playing for are attacking, and how their position, as Anthony just said, comes into play to be able to break play up. Because you mentioned it straight away, Pete. You've got a positional awareness is so important in that role.
Yeah, it is. It's massive. I think it's of the midfield positions. It's probably one of the nowadays becoming one of those the most crucial positions, because that's the one where if a team's pushing on you and they're causing you a problem, and the player and that central midfield player can break that play up, they would normally be clever enough to find the gaps to be able to play in. And I think Anthony said that really well. Is that ability to understand that you're defending, but you're looking to attack. I think that is so important. That's a really good point that Anthony makes there.
So when we're talking, we'll let Pete get the pad up and running, because we're going to have a look at this the role of the defensive midfield player as it would be in the Premier League at the moment. But before we do that, Anthony, let's just talk a little bit about what Pete said. So tactical awareness is one of those skills that we'll come onto that you're going to need. You're going to need that. You're going to need to be able to, vision as well. We talk about vision in a player. As a defensive midfield player now, would you say that vision's up there with the most important things? Almost like with a goalkeeper, it's important to be able to play with your feet and have that passing ability.
Oh, in possession, I think your job is to start those attacks, which means that you've got to be good with the ball. And I don't mean 1 or 2 or 3 out of 10. I would say 8, 9 or 10 out of 10 times you've got to keep not just good possession, but can you exploit the spaces that the other teams have left? And that then links to the psychology that Peter talked about, which is around our ability to not just play simple passes, but play passes that the opposition doesn't expect. So I think you've almost got to be thinking, and we talk about before, during and after, but before I receive that ball, what am I going to do? Can I then execute it? And can I then link in with my teammates? And I always say I've been doing some work with our central midfielders, and I'm going to name them because I think they're going to be brilliant. Jack Medlin, Kwaku, KJ and Isaac. The reason I'm saying that is we're talking about their ability to think about where's the ball, where's my opposition, where's my mate. And when they almost think about those 3 things on a constant basis, their decision making becomes almost paramount, and they're almost ahead of the game. And so therefore, by the time they've got the ball, they're already 2 or 3 steps ahead of their opposition. So the positional awareness, the vision, and the creativity with the ball, I think, are what we're talking about, starting to create that very good holding midfielder.
We're going to go over to you, Pete, and have a look at the pitch, and just have a look at that role of a defensive midfielder. And maybe when we're set up 11v11, we could pick a scenario, whoever's got the ball, where they may be looking to play. Let's first of all look at the playing in a 3 and the defensive midfield player in a 3, and how that might work.
Can you see my screen?
We can see your screen, yeah, we can see it.
Okay, great. That's the stock phrase now when you're doing all these webinars now.
The only thing you got to do is you got to move your little screen that's at the top right. You just got to make it a little bit smaller. Move it off the pitch, because Anthony, I keep telling him you can't have anything on the pitch, can you? You got to. That's like having cones on the pitch while the games are. That's it. That'll do. That's good.
I've tried to get some cones on the pitch when some of the teams that I've coached. So we're looking at the blue team are in the 3. So we're looking at, and this is an atypical scenario, say for example. So we start to look at this idea of the midfield 3 here working together. Now the 4, which is the typical defensive midfield, is looking to cover this area in here. So if you look at where the ball is, which is here, his role here would be to get in and make sure that the ball doesn't go into say the 11's feet. Okay, so even if the ball goes in the air, he's in a position that he can maybe turn and tackle from the front if necessary. Also, there's also that thing where if the player, if let's suppose say the 8 runs into an area here in between 10 and 11, that if the ball gets played in to the 8, the 10 can go across and now start to close down and cause some delay, and the 4 can come into this area here. Now, if you notice, the 8 now has nowhere to go and has to go backwards, which now helps the 9 to start to think about moving into these areas here. So we start looking at, can the 4 or the defensive midfield player start to dictate play to the opposition by their positioning? Now, if they get into the wrong position, say, for example, there, and this player is good enough and knocks it in here, you now got a 1v1 situation. And especially if you're playing with 2 forwards, you can end up with this situation where both centre-backs are having to mark. Now, that causes a problem. Now, if the 4 gets out of position there, now you've really got a problem, because this 11 now can turn in here and get a shot off at goal. And obviously that depends on the defensive skills of the 6. Would probably as a shape look a little bit more like that, I would think, where the defenders are looking to defend the width of the penalty box, say, for example.
Yeah, Anthony, I'll bring you in at any point here to ask any questions about this.
Yeah, I mean, for me, what Peter said, I totally agree with. When defending the 11 and the 9 from in front, what the tendency is for players is to keep looking over their shoulder. The problem with doing that when they look over their shoulder is that split second allows the 11 and the 9 to move into a different position. So we almost want the 4 to stand in such a way with their head positioning to be able to see both the 11 and the 9, and to stay at a reasonable distance, which allows them to cover the ground to be able to prevent that penetrating pass. So the distance from the 11 and the 9 is important, but their ability and their body shape and their positional awareness allows them to almost be on the front foot and almost sometimes invite the pass in. So as Peter's got it there now, if the 5 tries to play directly into 9, if the 4 knows his or her ground speed and knows the distance they can travel very, very quickly, which I think is also something they need to work on, they almost set a trap for the 5 to think, yes, I can feed that ball into that space, but the 4 knows that they can then affect the ball. And the reason I use the word affect the ball is because it's not necessarily sometimes about winning it. It's about making sure that the 9 or the 11 doesn't do something to hurt us.
And one of the questions that I'm going to put to you, Pete, and I know that you know this is coming, let's change that now to play in a 4-4-2. So we've talked about this many times, that there are teams that still play with 2 in midfield. We've talked about great players in the past that would have played in a 2. How does that differ? How does that role change if there's 2 players in that midfield? If one of the players are specifically designated to be the defensive side of the game and to be the defensive midfield player?
Okay, I'm so glad that you talked to me about this one, because this is something where I personally, and this is just my own thoughts about it, is I have a little bit of a bugbear about. So let's change that around a little bit. Now the Blues are now, say, attacking, but they might be attacking with, say, the 4 here. Okay. So now, so let's put the 11 back in here, say, for example. So they've just broken out now. We've got this situation going on. We should have this kind of thing happening here as well.
And the Reds are defending, and they've got 2 in midfield. They're playing a 4-4-2, let's say.
Exactly, yeah, 4-4-2. Now, this is the thing for me that I remember early in my coaching career, this was something that came up, and when we started off playing, the first team I really coached properly, they played a 4-4-2, and I very quickly realised that when you're playing a 4-4-2 and another team's playing a 3, they're not outnumbering you in midfield, because the formation itself tells you it is a 4-4-2. So you've got 4 midfielders. So why are they outnumbering you? So now you need to start to think about, well, this guy has no need to be out here, or this player here has no need to be out here. What we now need to do is we now need to start to think about how can we press that ball? How can 4 now start to think about doing this job in here? We probably would get this with a 4-3-3, the opposition pushing high and wide out here, hopefully hoping that they're going to pull our 2 fullbacks out so that they can play through. So now if the 8, say for example, can now go and put pressure on the ball or make play predictable, now the 4 recognizes that actually that I'm going to just stay. I'm just going to sit in here. That's all I'm going to do. My 7 can pull in, and my 11 can pull in. Actually, they're the wrong way around, aren't they? Yeah, they're the wrong way around. But let's do that. Let's do it properly, shall we? Right. So my 7 and my 11 can pull. Now, part of what we do, we might turn around and say, well, I tell you what, we will allow this ball here, because what can now happen is this can happen, and then the 4 can just drop into here.
That's it.
5 comes in here. 2 comes. Do you remember, Anthony? We saw some footage once of a game that your club was in, and we talked about that. Do you remember that?
Yep.
We talked about, well, what's the role of the 4 and who should have covered in here and so on and so forth. This is the same type of thing, because sometimes the 4's just got to go, I'm just going to kill the space.
Yeah.
Just going to kill it in here. So if the 7 gets it, I mean, he's going to have to be a hell of a good player to beat the 2. And if he does beat the 2, 4 can come across.
Right. That's correct. Yeah.
And now we start doing this. We start killing spaces, in here, and making the pitch small. We might even get one of the 2 4s just to drop in here as well, because now if we do this 9 now can say, well, okay, I'm going to pretend I'm not interested and let you play that one. And as that happens, I'm now going to press you. But all of that will come off of the 4's positioning.
Correct.
So the players are all linked. And it's some of the things that I think for coaches is to understand not only the position of the player, but how they're linked to the other players in their unit and the units around them, whether that's a vertical unit, a horizontal unit, etc., and where can they fill in spaces.
So we've had a question in. I'm going to put this to Anthony. Kevin says, would you coach a 5 or a 6 or an 8 or a 10 into a defensive midfield player if you didn't have one in your squad?
Definitely. That's the simple answer. I think depending on the age, of the person asking the question and the team that we're talking about, position specialization should come later in a player's development. So I mentioned Jack Medlin, for example, with our AFC Wimbledon under 18s currently. He's been played most of his career as a centre-back, but now we are working extensively on him as a holding midfielder. And the difference is, and this is from him himself, is he's so used to seeing the game and the whole game. Now playing in midfield, he has to have that 360-degree observation skill. So I would always encourage a defender to step in to midfield and play up front, because what it will teach them is the rudiments and the movements of the opposition. I would also say if you're playing number 8 or number 10, it should also be part of your DNA to get yourselves into good positions when we're out of possession. The difference, I think, is sometimes attitude. Your number 4 generally wants to be that person who wants to break up the play. And I'm going to, dare I say this, kick people, win the ball, and then give it to someone else who then gets all the glory. Which is why when we talk about Fabinho at Liverpool, for me, I think he's maybe one of the people that most people don't talk about. And that's because he'll give the ball to the others to go and get all of the glory. So I would definitely coach a number 5 or number 6 to be a holding midfielder. And I would definitely work with the 8 and 10, because when the number 4 does drive forward beyond the 8 and 10, I would expect one of those to fill in for that player for that period of time, Ben.
Yeah, it's a very, very good answer, Kevin. There you go. You've got your answer from Anthony. And don't forget, you can keep your questions coming in. Do let us know across social media if you've got any questions about the defensive midfield player. If you've got any thoughts on it, maybe you coach at a club and you've had to go through this. You've had to coach somebody in this role and you want to share some of that knowledge with the coaching community. Get involved tonight and we'll read some of them out and we'll put them on the screen as well. We're going to go back to Pete, who's doing all sorts of things with his screen. Pete, back to you.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at the three, you look at the players in the three. If we give the ball back to, they've now picked it up. Now, all of these things we have to remember. It all depends on where the ball is. So what happens if something like this happens and the ball's won, and now there's space for the team to attack you in these kind of areas here? So now we might see the 9 going into gaps here. Now, whose job is that? Now, in this situation here, can the 4 get across? Well, I doubt if that 4 could get across. So now it's the 4's role, quite possibly, to encourage the 8 to go into that space there, which pulls the 10 across, which now pulls the 4 to go into that area to kill that space. But we'd end up with this again. We'd end up with things like this. What do you reckon, Anthony?
I'd be worried about the number 10 there.
Well, this 10?
Too much time and space for the red 10.
Oh yeah. He's there, right? But I would, in this situation here, you might need to think about. I would think. I don't know what you might think. Is in the first instance might be to get the 10 to stop that ball going in there, or the 10 just drops in and marks that play there. But the thing that would worry me slightly is what are 3 and 6 doing?
Get them up the pitch.
Yeah. So it might be a bit of that. Yeah. Get in here. Yeah. Get in here, get up, which now allows this to happen, doesn't it? Now we really do box it off. So if you look at the 10 now, the 10's is kind of out of the equation. If they want to play into the 9, the only thing that you might need to worry about is the overlap here of the 11 and possibly the 3 coming up to overload to isolate. But if this 5 does their job properly and 4 comes in here and double teams again, and then 2 comes in here, again, we could probably negate that situation. And then,
Pete, it comes down to philosophy, doesn't it? Because most people there at that point are going to try and show away from the goal down towards the corner flag, which hopefully gives the troops time to recoup and regroup.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if that's the philosophy, because some people will say, no, we want to show him into the crowd.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I agree with that, but hey, then what we want the coaches to be able to do is, well, if that's what you want, you need to be quite clear about how your number 4 provides cover, and where does the balance come from in terms of the 6-3, and how does the 10 recover?
Yes,
alongside the number 8. So I think you're perfectly right to say that, because by that now you've got a 3v1 in terms of in possession, and it looks as though the number 9 is going to play the ball into that channel, doesn't it?
That's right. Yeah,
for the number 11.
That's right. Yeah, and then it's that because even though that might look like that's quite simple, the 11 might have to be a little bit because in this situation the 11 could get a bit excited and go and get offside.
Yeah,
because that's the other thing as well. Because sometimes players say, "Oh my God, he's here," and if this 5 does their job well and comes and defends it there and starts to make I'm going to make it really difficult for this player, because now you can if we go to this here. And we look at that kind of looks, like we've really got some how can I put it? We're really looking at working with this player here, and their body position around, making sure that they get nice and tight here, but not so tight that they cause themselves a problem. Yeah. And they can be easily turned, And all these sort of things are really, really important. That's the detail there, isn't it, Anthony?
Yeah, that's right.
Where's your feet?
Yep.
Which way are you showing him? How are you showing him? Have you noticed recently that players are starting to like try and make themselves bigger? They'll have their arms out until there's a cross coming in that's behind their backs.
Yeah.
So it's that sort of stuff that.
Before we move on to just identify, I just want to identify some of the key attributes and the key skills that somebody in this position would need, because that's how we're going to have the basis of our practice that we're going to come on to it in a moment. Do just need to mention players that are perhaps defensive midfield players, but also good going forward. We touched on Vieira at the top of the show. Steven Gerrard is another one that you could put in that category of a complete midfield player. He can play in the defensive role. He could tackle Steven Gerrard, but he could also get up the pitch. When we look now, we've got a few players that we identified a little bit earlier. Ruben Neves at Wolves does that very well. You could say he can tackle, he can play, and he can score a hell of goals. And another player at the top of the game is Fernandes, who's just come into Manchester United. Can tackle, is a bit ferocious, is a playmaker, can also get into the box as well and score goals. So we're seeing players that not only can play that defensive midfield role, but also can get up and score goals. What kind of difference is there in those kind of players? Maybe looking at the Makelele and the Gerrard, who both good tacklers, both can play that role, but Gerrard can get forward and scores many more goals.
It's just I would add Luka Modric to that.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
On the basis of these guys a lot of them have very low center of gravity, so their ground speed, especially over the first 5, 6, 8 yards, is very, very quick. And if they have the speed of mind, Ben, so if you're talking about attributes that a player needs, they need speed of mind. Okay, Peter earlier spoke about the ability to read the game, but also if we're talking about then starting the attack, we need quality in possession. So not just good decision making, but their execution skills, whether it's a pass, a shot, cross, whatever it is, a trick, they need to be able to execute it. And that's when people like Xavi, Iniesta, they start to come to the fore with, because they can play passes that actually turn corners.
Let's. I'm going to bring you in a second, Pete, but we want to get the practice underway as well. Let's focus on this role and identify the top 3 skills, and I know there'd be more than that, but the top 3 things that you would need and you would require as a coach in a defensive midfield player.
But in possession or out of possession, then let's be really clear.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I was trying to think of the top 3 in general. Okay, I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll let you have 5, which includes in and out of possession. So, would you say that 3 of those you'd look for in the? Well, maybe you wouldn't. Maybe in the modern game you'd be saying, well, I want 3 in possession and 2 out of possession. You've only got 5 to choose from. I'm going to set you that task.
Okay.
Top skills of a defensive midfield player. Things that you would say, okay, I need to look at what I need in a defensive midfield player so that I know how to put my practice together and what I'm going to be working on with that player.
Okay. Well, my first one would be your ability to read the game. And I'm going to use that both in and out of possession. I think your scanning skills and observation, and that links to your decision making, has to be critical. Out of possession, I think you need to be able to communicate concisely and precisely your information to your teammates. In possession, I think our ability to get hold of, and I'm saying control the ball appropriately, and then play that critical pass that then starts the next attack. So those would be my 5.
I've got a couple of other questions for you as well. So we've got our key skills. What about, can you be taught from a young age this? Is this something that perhaps if you're coaching right now and you're coaching an under 8s, an under 9s, under 10s, you can start to teach this, and how would you go about doing that?
I think we start with the basics of football. Everything for me will always link to the principles of play. So if we are out of possession, our first job is to protect the goal and deny a goal scoring opportunity. How do we do that? Well, it depends what part of the pitch we're on and the ability of the opposition. So if we start to think about those things from the very, very beginning, we start to then help the players, purely because regardless of our age, when we don't have the ball, can someone affect it? Now, if I'm not the closest person, what do I need to do to help my teammate? If I'm the furthest person away, when may I come into play? So if that's the kind of process of thinking, as a coach now, we're thinking, okay, that player's on the ball. What do we need to happen? When you're around the ball, what do you need to happen? And if we're furthest away, what can we anticipate might happen so that we're starting to get into those positions of readiness? That would be the way I would start to think about it, Ben. And then I would just create loads of different scenarios on the pitch, in the final third, middle third, in the channels, closer to our goal, in our penalty box, on the corners of the penalty box, which is actually different from central. There's just it just creates a manifestation of things that we could do. And I get excited when we start talking about things like this.
I can tell, and that's what we want. Before we head over to the screen, where I know Pete's going to start to create a practice, which you of course can comment on across social media. Pete, I'm gonna ask you, before we start this, if you it would obviously matter all the time what age group you were coaching. You mentioned before, you were on the show last week with Frank, who's coach of Merstham. We played step 3 of the English Pyramids. And you said, look, if I was coaching one of your players, the practice would look very different. So we've got to take that into account. But when we're talking about the defensive midfield player, would you be, at a younger age especially, looking to just coach an all-round midfield player? You wouldn't be specifically saying for an under-10s or under-12s, I need a defensive midfield player, I'm going to coach to be a defensive midfield player. You'd want to make that player as all-round as they possibly could, because that's the age that they're going to develop.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think anybody who thinks that you should be looking at making players a specific position at too early an age, you're hurting that player, because we don't know at 10 what that player is going to be. That player at 10 could be in playing midfield or centre forward, but could end up as a goalkeeper. We don't know. So the thing that we've got to try and do is we've got to try and give players a much more rounded experience when they're at training. So get them to practice playing in different positions in training. Don't make it a surprise to the player when he turns up for training, he or she turns up for training, and all of a for a match, and all of a sudden you're saying to that player, "Oh, tell you what you're going to do. You're going to play in goal today." Well, if you're going to play in goal, get the player to play in goal during training, because it will help the player to understand the position, firstly, and secondly, they don't have this fear that they're going to be playing in a foreign position. I remember seeing a young player once. I wasn't the coach at the time. I wasn't the coach, but I watched this player. He was told, "Oh, you're going to play in." I think it was you're going to play right back. The kid was in tears. So, he said, "Oh, I've never played there before. I don't want to play there. Please don't make me play there." And the coach made him play there. I said to him, it was going to be good for him. Well, that's not good for him, because he's distraught. And that's the time when a coach has got to be a little bit clever.
That's right.
So how do we? So let's have a look at then. How do we go about putting together a practice on improving defensive midfield players, firstly, and secondly, how do we produce that session that looks at that identifies really the individual needs of the player? Because they're two different things, really. Trying to coach somebody to be a defensive midfield player, but also identifying their own needs of what they need to work on.
Ben, I think you made a fantastic point there, which I think most coaches need to think about, which is, what does the individual need to develop, and what do we need to develop for them to be better as part of a team structure? Now, if we think about players at your under 8s, they are developing, and they will be developing until they get into a first team. So I think the coach has a responsibility to really help that player to understand and practice a variety of positions and a variety of situations. I hope that feels comfortable. So from an under 8 to under 12, we talk about the fundamentals and developing them, in the four corners, but making them develop their ball mastery and their understanding of how to manipulate a ball. So whether that's receiving under pressure, whether that's the ability to tackle properly, those are the things that we need to hone from a very, very young age. And therefore, if we talk about receiving under pressure for a central midfielder, the common thing now is that the two centre-backs split, the number 4, the holding midfielder, will drop in and possibly receive the ball and then play out from there. But if we don't work on that receiving under pressure, then that player is never going to be able to come and receive that ball. So I think it starts from a very young age. One of the things that we're doing at our club at the moment is ensuring that we don't specialise too early and we don't almost pigeonhole people, because a growth spurt can happen. Their body structure can change, and therefore it might just change how they approach the game. So I think giving them the holistic skills that Paul mentioned, and Peter mentioned, should I say, in all the four corners, will help them develop as individuals, which then fit into a team and tactical structure.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's have a look at a practice plan, and let's start to put this together. And hopefully it's something that you can take away, and whatever club that you're with, you can adapt it, because that's what it's about. It's what we say every week. It's about adapting things to your team and to your individuals. So we're going to have a look at a practice plan around defensive midfielders now, Pete.
Okay, so the first thing that you have to think about when you're starting to plan is, who are you looking to work with? So in this instance, what we've got here is we've got 3 midfield players and 3 on each side. So now, if we're going to be really specific here, if we're saying it depends on our structure. If we might play with two defending midfield players, so it might look like that. We might play with one central midfield. It really does depend on what your philosophy is. You might play with 4 in midfield. So again, what does that look like? So being specific about who you're going to be working with in your session in the first instance is the big thing. So let's make some assumptions first of all. Let's say we are a team and we play with a midfield 3. We'll look at a 4 in a second. So the first thing I'm going to think about, right, okay, what do the midfield players do? Well, they kind of tend to work up and down the pitch from one end to the other. But the defensive zone that they're going to be looking at will be to try and stop the ball maybe getting into an end zone. Let's have a look. An end zone, say here. All right. So that might be part of our practice. So we've got an end zone that we might be stopping them from getting into.
Anthony, you come in at any time, by the way.
Yeah, go for it, mate. Go for it.
Yeah, so we might have something like that. Then we start to think about, well, actually, in certain parts of the pitch, these midfield players may have to defend the whole of this area here. But then you start to think about it. Well, do they really? Well, actually, if you think about it, and I'm just drawing this up to give some context to what we're looking for when we're starting to plan, because our planning part is important, is that in this area here, in a 4-3-3, we would probably have a wide player who would look after this area here. So we then start to think about something like, if I don't want this area included, I might just blot out this area here and say, okay, we're not going to play in this area here at the moment as part of the plan. Okay, so we have to also think about our squad size as well. So who's going to be in our squad? How many players are coming up? Now, this, if you think about it, this is the key area that the midfield players are going to be defending. Those midfield players. So now we then start to think about, what about the area of the pitch that's really, really dangerous? And we're now talking about that area in and around the penalty box. So we might now start to look at this area here. Okay, an area like that they'll have to defend. Now, for me, in any defending practice, and this is just me, I think to myself, defend an area.
Yes.
Yeah. Would you agree with that, Anthony?
Defend something. Always defend something. Yep.
Yeah. Whether it's be a goal, a stick, next door's cat, or whatever it is, but whatever it is, defend something. So the players know now where I'm going to show my show my players. So you now have this area here, and we might play a little 3v3, say for example, where the ball's moving about. Let me tell you what. Let me animate this. I think I'd like to do that. Can I do a live animation, Ben?
You can go for it. You do a live animation. There we go.
Right. I hope this works. Okay. Anthony, jump in any time.
Yeah, cool. Keep going, mate. You're doing brilliantly.
So now we might have this situation. So say the 7 runs in that area here. So 10 might decide, these players might decide to tell you what, we'll sit in. Mm-hmm. Okay? We'll sit in here. All right? Because they won't necessarily press. So in this situation, quite possibly, would I expect this number 10 here to go and press that? No, comfortable possession for that player there. So 7.
Pete, if we just let's link it to principles of play, because if we say basically, I can't see the number because the ball's on top of the player. What number is that?
Yeah. That is number 8.
Okay, so the number 8's got the ball, and simply put, there's no pressure on the ball. Exactly. So what do we do as a team? We collectively get into a shape that protects the area that we're stopping them getting into, correct?
That's correct. That's quite correct. So now the 8 has got a couple of things that he or she could do. Drive forward with the ball into this area here, which now engages 10. 4 comes across to now stop the ball from going into that area. 8 comes across here. It now means that 7 can drop into this space here. And now 4 can push forward if he or she wants to. Now, again, depending on the player and the skill set, they might decide to play that ball here. Okay? Now, if they play that ball, I would expect 8 to be moving as the ball is traveling towards the 7 in here. Okay? So by the time the ball reaches 7, 8's already engaging. 4 has now come across very quickly. And we might now be thinking, as that ball is traveling, as this 7's got to get control of the ball, is could we be brave and go in and be aggressive in our press here to try and win the ball? Because if we win that, we've got an opportunity to attack, say, in this area here. So now 4 can now travel with the ball, which is actually also, and I don't know if you agree or disagree, Anthony, is a kind of a key skill of a 4 sometimes to win it and travel with it.
Yeah.
So now, if you look at this situation now, who's now the first line of defence in this practice for the Reds? It's the 4. We now start to think about principles of play for defending. So because the 7 and 8 are quite high up, 4 now has to delay to allow 8 and 7 to get back into position to stop the 4, with possibly the idea of maybe either 10 or 8 getting forward in this position here, and then 8 becomes the new 4, if you like.
Pete, I just want to ask you a question very quickly.
Yeah.
If this is a practice, there's obviously 6 players involved here. What sort of size, because it's very hard sometimes to get a grasp on it looking at that, what sort of size would you need? Because there'll be coaches watching that will say, I love this is fantastic, this would work for my team, but it's not incorporating all the players just yet. We may get to that, but also what sort of size would I need? Because sometimes you've only got half a pitch that you're sharing with other clubs to put this on, but this is the kind of practice that you probably wouldn't need too much room, and you could certainly have different groups doing this.
Yes, and again, I have I'm not going to turn around and say to you that I have a map of in my head all the different sizes, but I'm talking about maybe this would probably be about 50 yards, maybe something like that, and that might be about 35 yards, because there's a bit of work for the players to do in this session. You could probably make it smaller, depending on depending on the players, depending on their levels of fitness, where they are, their abilities, that sort of stuff. So we end up with this. So what we have in a practice like this is that we have the players getting lots and lots and lots of goes of practicing that thing around defending as a midfield three, defending the different spaces, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, don't forget to get your thoughts into us as well. Let us know what you think. If you're coaching a specific club, maybe you've got a few questions around this practice because you want to bring it in to coach your under 14s. Let us know. We'll put the questions to the guys. And also, if you're not watching this live, do get your questions in, because we will get back to you. Anthony, I'm just going to come to you very quickly as we watch this. That thing around expanding practices. These are all. We're very fluid. We're very moving. We can make sure when we're coaching that these kind of things can happen in match situations as well. Pete did a great practice last week where we started with 11v11, I think it was, or 10v10, and there were little things going on within that. So all of these ideas that we have, Anthony, they can be put on in different ways.
I totally, Ben. And just to go back to your original question to Peter, which I think Peter gave you a very diplomatic answer. If we go back to simple coaching principles around step principle, depending on the size, ability, and the facilities that you have, you just adjust it to make it either more challenging or more easier to get success for the players. Mm-hmm. So let's not forget that, Peter might have a specific size because he might be working in his mind with specific players, but you know your players and you know their abilities. If you make it too big, it's just going to be quite, too easy for one team or the other. And if it's too small, they may never get a chance to beat the opposition. But also then if you strip it back, you look at what outcomes are you looking for from that practice. So what do you want the players to be able to do? You want them to protect the space that Peter's got in those two boxes. Well, how does that look in a game? And how does it look in training? And can we try to marry up the two? And then just moving that on, depending on the numbers as well, because how long would the number 8 have the ball for, and the 10, the 8 and the 4 defend for in a game? We're talking about maybe 4 seconds, 5 seconds, maybe before they have reinforcements coming in. So if you incorporate those kind of considerations into the practice, which is Reds, you've got the ball, you've got 10 seconds to try and get into the box. If you don't get it, the Blues now get it, their opportunity comes, because it tries to create the realism of the practice in terms of their decision making and their speed of approach. Does that sit comfortably, Ben?
Yeah, no, understood, and I think that's something that we tried to get across last week, and we've done it again tonight, where it's a situation where you have to adapt it to your team, to the individual players that you've got, and also you can, as Pete I've heard say many a times, Anthony as well, you've got to make it realistic, you've got to make it real, and you can set different scenarios, different boundaries, different interpretations of what that looks like.
Yeah. See, using this practice, I think you could, Pete, you've done brilliantly here. This could cover a multitude of topics for the number 4, the 8 and the 10. And one thing that I would do, if Pete, if you can just draw just to either side of the box, white box to the left, if you just draw a little circle or anything like that.
Okay.
I'm just going to try and elaborate on how we then start to improve our ability to read the play, but also our awareness.
So a little circle there, yeah?
Yeah, but a little bit further forwards towards the blue line.
Okay.
Okay, we'll get that move for you, Anthony. Just what we like to do is also on this show is just put Pete's skills to the test from a technological standpoint as much as possible.
Did know it was coming. We did discuss this earlier. I'm gonna just throw a couple of curveballs in, but
yeah,
Right, go on.
that's what I always try and do that. So I'm glad you're doing it tonight, Anthony. Don't forget as well, while Pete does this, let us know your thoughts on this practice. Anything else that you want to ask, get your comments in. We'll put them on the screen, and we'll try and answer as many as we can in the final 5 minutes that we have left of this show.
So you want your circle, Anthony? Let's just say.
That circle's fine. So Ben, you asked about the attributes of the number 4, the holding midfielder, and I said ability to read the play. So if we imagine where the number 4, the blue number 4, is currently standing, there would still be opposition behind that player. So what we want to remember is we're defending the white box, but we might also be defending moving players. And I talked about building up a 360-degree vision. So we might have the coach standing in that area with different coloured cones. And their job is to hold up the colour cone and just shout the name of the player. And the player's got to be able to see what the colour of the cone is as soon as the coach says it. Because now what we're saying is, even though the ball is in front of you, can you still recognise what's happening to the side and behind you? Does that Pete? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really, especially when you're starting to talk about young players, isn't it? You know, when you're starting to develop them into to be able to have those sets of skills that you say that you want them to have. You know, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, there's so many areas that we can change, develop, and continue to grow on all of these practices. And as we said, get in touch if you've got any ideas or you've got any questions on this. So you can do this throughout the week across social media. We've only got a couple of minutes left. One thing I did want to ask is, and we hear this a lot as well, we've heard it a lot in football, especially when maybe the 4-4-2 was more prevalent and more dominant in the game. When you look at some players, you've mentioned so many skills, Anthony, that players need in this position. Vision, awareness, being agile, agility. When you look at someone like Paul Scholes, who, especially later on in his career, played almost this holding role and was just exceptional with passing, his vision and his passes and his ability on the ball and his awareness of space was probably the best the Premier League's ever seen. And yet his tackling, I mean, that was something else. Could he get away with being that good at the other things? Can he almost get away with that, or do you really then rely on a teammate to be good at tackling? And it's not that Paul Scholes didn't tackle, by the way, because he did. That's
correct. But how did he get the ball then?
Well, he was. It's the pockets of spaces that he came in. Do you know what? One thing I will say, I'm trying to answer your question, Anthony, with Paul Scholes, is his spatial awareness, I think, was better than anybody else I've ever seen. Because every time he got the ball, it was one touch to get himself facing forward, and that was incredible. Okay,
so you remember those 5 attributes that we said? Your ability to read the play both in and out of possession.
Yeah.
And depending on who you're playing with, you are able to find yourself in a place where your teammate will find you. But then when the ball is traveling towards you, like I said earlier, your decision making on what's happening before you get the ball, what you're going to do with it as you get it, and that now when we talk about receiving the ball under pressure and your first touch being a touch to either exploit space or to create space or to manipulate the defender, that was where his first touch was almost 100% in terms of quality. And that's something that, again, we can teach players by putting them in practice situations and game situations where their teammates maybe don't ignore them. So in a practice, it's easy to say, don't pass it to him or her because they've got a player on them. We should be going the other way and saying, give them the ball. Let's see how they get out of that situation.
Yeah.
And then now, in 3 or 5 years' time, you find that they're able to do it on a consistent basis.
We'll talk about creative midfield players and playmakers, definitely, in another session. We've got 30 seconds left. Pete, I'm going to give you the final word on this. Brilliant session. Thank you so much. Brilliant practice there. Anyone's got any questions, of course, you can get hold of Pete on social media as well. What's your social media handle, Pete?
At Surrey_CCD.
And Anthony, your one as well.
It's at B for Bravo, 19, A for Alpha, L for Lima, F for Foxtrot.
Brilliant. So get in touch with us, get in touch with Anthony, with Pete, if you've got any thoughts on the session. Thank you so much for watching. One last question before we go on defensive midfield players. Keep this short because we're running out of time. But if you'd have had Paul Scholes and he had all those attributes, would you have just potentially just slightly worked on the tackling a little bit?
Yeah, maybe.
I think that says it all. Thanks for watching tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it. And don't forget, we'll be back again next week with Coach's Corner. I'll be back here at 8 o'clock. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you then. Good night.